So the trend of having a new LLM continues. What we have this week is a brand new large language model called LAMA 3.2, and it has some interesting capabilities. Let's talk about it. First thing that you'll see when you enter the website, which is the blog post, they are now rebranding or trying to talk of an area which has so far not been touched, which is edge. So running AI on edge, which is closer to devices which are low on compute, was the new trend that was anticipated, and we are now seeing language models in that space. So you have two language models, as the image says, the llama 1 billion and llama 3 billion parameter. And then I think that Meta is catching up here with the vision part, because some of the other ones like ChatGPT has already done it, and then they have added vision capabilities. So they have two multimodal models, 11 billion and 90 billion. And if you just take a pause and think of 90 billion as the number, let's just see how many zeros it has. Okay, how many zeros? Okay, let's just look at it. Yeah, so this is 90 billion. So this is a hell lot of number. So it's like 9 into 10 to the power 10. So this is the number of parameters that this model has, which is just crazy. I think people have now almost defaulted to thinking of large language models and number of parameters, but it's important to appreciate the sheer magnitude of it, right? When we do machine learning models, you have like a couple of hundred or thousand dimensions and things like that. These are billion parameter models. All right, some key takeaways: they are releasing the new 3.2, which is in two sizes, includes small and medium sized vision LLMs 11 and 90. The 90 billion is still medium. God knows what's going to be the huge ones. And lightweight, there are two text only models which are edge specific, which is the 1 billion and 3 billion. And the 3.2, 1 billion and 3 billion models support 128K tokens. So imagine mobile apps powered by these. It will be just crazy. Now, supported by the brand ecosystem, the 3.2, 11 billion and 90 billion models are drop-in replacement to their corresponding text equivalents. Basically, they are exceeding on image understanding tasks compared to closed models such as Claude 3, unlike other multimodal. Both pre-trained and aligned models are available for fine-tuning, which means you can actually use these models to fine-tune and build your own image kind of scenario. So if you have something like marketing use cases where you want to develop images tuned to your text, you should be able to do this. And then there's a lot of things they are talking about stack. They are sharing the first official llama stack distribution. So llama index has been a great library, but now they are getting into how should developers work with llama models in different environments, including single node, on-prem, etc., etc. And additionally, what I have seen is, which is something I'll show, AWS llama 3.2. So the day they announced it, AWS literally published it in AWS Bedrock, which is just crazy if you think about it, right? So they're doing a lot of faster time to integration. So the moment a model is released, most likely they were working in the background, but this is just great stuff altogether. What else is there? They have some openness, evaluation, etc., etc. Will not get into that. Let's look at model evaluations, which everybody is always interested in. And as anticipated, as expected, surprisingly, they are comparing with GPT-4o Mini and Haiku for vision tasks. They are not comparing to 4o from a vision perspective. I haven't actually looked at Strawberry to comment. So again, compared to those models, they are pretty much beating across the board, which is not surprising. Anytime anybody releases a new LLM, they somehow find a way to beat others across the waters. Like at this point in time, I've stopped trusting these benchmarks completely. There are also lightweight instruction tuning benchmarks that they have looked at, and this is very interesting for me, because if you're trying to get into an instruction tune model, like use something the likes of Gemma or Phi, these models are doing pretty good. So instruction tuning, doing small applications could be very, very good. This still is not significantly high, I would say, looking at the numbers, except barring certain tasks. But like for example, math is still just basically acceptable. Even though they have shown a different color, GPT-O Mini is 86, which is much higher than, Phi is much higher than this. So blue is not the best, is something that you have to understand. And in terms of vision models, they are just trying to give some scenarios as to interior design assistant. How can you build? How does lightweight model pruning work? So there's a whole pruning and distillation process that they are covering essentially, and also getting into the under the hood scenarios, talking about some specific use cases and all that. So without trying to get into any of this, and this is by the way is the LAMA stack API, which is very, very interesting. But again, without getting into this, let me just go on to the demo. So there I want to do the image part. So what I'm going to do is you can actually go to the prompts, and it has some interesting ones like a chef plating a meal, and all of these images I feel are great, but I'm probably not sure why I will want to generate these images. So I'm going to ask it something very clear. So generate a YouTube thumbnail for me where I am talking about Meta new LLM Llama 3.2. Okay, let's see what it throws at me. There could be some variations that it's cooking up, which is nice. So typically it's trying to give me 4 options, which is good. I have no idea who these people are, but I kind of like the first thumbnail, to be very honest about it. Yeah, no idea why, but this looks really imagined with AI. This is okay. So they have also added imagined with AI. These actually look awfully like a couple of people. I'm actually going to download and save this for this thumbnail because this looks pretty cool. There's an option to animate it as well, and let's see what it does. Now animation gives you the ability to, it's still not all the way towards a video, but yeah, this is what you get. So it's almost scary looking, by the way. So I'm not gonna put this, but let's just go back to the previous step. Edit, change the, let's say, resolution to 1280 cross 720, because that's the resolution that thumbnails have. I'm just trying to see how much of image operations it understands. At this stage, I also want to change it. Now this is just screwed it up. No idea why it did what. It's just probably capturing a completely new prompt. I don't like that. So I'm gonna go back and just make more edits and say that this is great but little scary. Have the animal less scary. The good part about the image generation, and I know I'm talking this through, is the text is very good, like nicely written. So that has been a challenge in previous vision based models, at least the ones that I've experimented. Yeah, so this now is bringing some other gentleman into this conversation. So essentially every edit that you make is a new one. I have no idea why this should not be the case, but again, you can play with it, animate it and things like that. So this is very interesting tech in terms of it. Now in terms of capabilities of whether we stand with this model, don't know. So we'll see in the future how this thing shapes up. But to me, this looks pretty exciting, interesting. Some capabilities and challenges that I've particularly seen in the past about language models around vision seems to be growing better. So yeah, fingers crossed. But again, some of the things that you see here, right? The text here on the is not right. If you actually go on and focus into different parts of the image, you'll start to realize that some weird geometries are there, some weird shapes are there, some things just beating physics and all that. But that's part of the game. I think evolution is going to happen. And with that, yeah, thank you for listening to me. Bye bye.